right. The story that I'm going to read out of the book tonight, when we did this a few weeks ago, I'm going to do a different story than we did that night. And the one I'm going to do tonight, I think the title of the book is We're the Wolverines. And I think what that exemplifies is that as a community, we all come together. We all have a common support. And when you look back over the years, over the decades, and just the fervor in this town and how people have come together, they've supported the school, they've supported education in Woodruff, and they've supported the Wolverines. The story I'm going to read tonight, and this was, and if I'm being honest with myself, if I'm being honest with you, this was probably the most emotional of the 21 stories that I wrote for the book. And this happened, I was 2 years old when this happened, so I don't remember it, but I've got family who were in high school at the time who experienced this, and I've heard the stories, and I've heard the stories of the heroism that took place. And that was when our high school burned in 1987. Was an act of arson. Two young men who were on a vandalism spree through the town that night. They targeted all four schools, and when they got to the high school, I don't know that the intention was, and I can't speculate to this, I don't know that the intention was to actually burn the school down, but they started a small fire in the lobby, and from there it spread. It got into the ductwork and the air conditioning vents, and from there the ball game was really just over. The entire school burned and was lost. But from out of that tragedy really arose one of the great stories that I think exemplifies the unity of the Woodruff community and how everybody comes together under one common goal and one common banner. And it was, when I was putting all of this together, it was a story that I felt like had to be told, and I was going to tell it. And so that's what I'm going to read to you tonight. And the story is, I titled this chapter, Pulled from the Flames. And when I was getting ready to write the story, I do want to throw this in there. Not only am I going to read this story, you're going to get a little small lesson in Greek mythology, because I was trying to figure out a way to tie the story into the heroism that night and to what the impact of this event was to Woodruff at the time. And what I came up with was the story of the Phoenix in Greek mythology. And it just tied in so well, because if you read and study the legend of the Phoenix, only one Phoenix can live at a time. And before a Phoenix can be reborn, it must first be consumed by fire. And it was out of the flames and out of the ashes that the new Woodruff High School rose, and it was through the great efforts of the individuals who risked everything to save our history and to save our legacy that night that really made what came in the years after that possible. And so that's what the story's about, and I'm going to go ahead and read that one for you, and I hope you enjoy it. But the title is Pulled from the Flames. The preface says, on a cold January night in 1987, a spree of vandalism by three youths ended with Woodruff's beloved high school engulfed in flames, and a group of proud Wolverines risking their lives to save its history from the midst of the inferno. In Greek mythology, there is a tale of a magnificent bird known as the phoenix. It was the symbol of renewal and rebirth. Upon its death, a phoenix would be consumed by fire, only to rise again from the ashes, born anew from the flames. The night of January 11th, 1987, witnessed Woodruff's Phoenix, its beloved high school, consumed in a fiery conflagration, but a few brave souls would be the salvation of its history, from which the new symbol of our town would be resurrected from the smoldering remains. For there to be a rebirth, there must first be a death. On that frigid night, Terry Cox never imagined that as the sun waned below the horizon, that in only a few hours' time, he and Coach Varner, along with an unheralded band of heroes, would risk their own lives so that the historical lifeblood of Woodruff High School would live on. During the early morning hours, three local youths who had been engaged in a spree of vandalism targeting all four schools in town put into motion their final egregious act. After breaking a window to enter the high school, they ignited a small fire inside the building before they fled into the darkness. Unbeknownst to them or anyone else, a few sparks were pulled into the school's air ducts and set into motion a chain of events which would both devastate and define the indomitable spirit of Woodruff. Cox had not planned to be awake during those wee hours, but summoned from his bed to the kitchen of his parents' house across the street from the school on Cross Anchor Road, the quarterback of the Wolverines' 1978 state championship football team joined his father at the window as the elder Cox mused about the return of winter weather. or so it briefly seemed. I was engaged, but I was living at home and working as a supervisor for Inman Mills and was off that night, recalled Cox. Dad had gotten up to get a glass of water and he looked out the window, and I don't know what made me get up, but I had gotten up also. He said, "Doggone, Terry, I just looked out the window and it's snowing." It took only a moment for Cox to realize that what his father mistook for snowflakes was something far more sinister than a passing flurry. I looked out the window and I said, "Pops, it's not snowing. The school's on fire," he continued. It was the ash falling. It was drifting over to our yard, and you could see the ash and embers falling in our yard. I went to the front door and said, "Lord have mercy." I just put on my jeans and clothes and ran over there. Meanwhile, less than a mile away on LaSalle Court, word the school was burning had reached Coach Varner at his home too. Tony Sloan will never forget her mother Frances's voice on the other end of the phone that night. I remember Mom calling and she said, "Your dad's at the school. It's burning." And I thought, "What do you mean it's burning?" And Mom said, "It's on fire." We immediately left and came down here, and by that point there were already a lot of people working to salvage and save, and the fire department was down there as well. The Woodruff High School gym has always had a certain degree of majesty attached to it, with some affectionately calling it a museum. It's an accurate moniker because, well, that's exactly what it is and has always been. A tradition started by Coach Varner, the walls of Woodruff's gym are a living tapestry to the life of an athletic program with an infinitely rich history and a sense of pride. Photos adorn the walls commemorating every championship team, each team that competed for a title, or the inaugural squad to represent Woodruff High in each sport. Generations of Wolverines have had their names enshrined on plaques that cover the walls in every corner of the building, showing accomplishments from intramural sports to official team endeavors. Grandfathers, fathers, husbands, sons, grandmothers, mothers, wives, and daughters have their litany of achievements displayed for all who visit to see. And it has always been a way for Woodruff to bridge the generational gap for a school whose story dates back over a century. As the flames grew, and with the school quickly turning into an inferno, that history was in mortal danger of being reduced to nothing more than a pile of ash, and all tangible traces of what was and what had been were going up in thick, acrid smoke. Cox reached the burning building and saw an opening. By sheer luck, the flames had not yet made it to the gym by the time he had arrived, but time to act was growing short, and Terry never hesitated. The glass on one of the front doors was broken, and I just remember going through, and the flames were already pretty good where I guess the chemistry room was, and the flames were already starting to come out of the windows up top. So I just went through that window and door right there, explained Cox. I opened that door, and I went down into the locker rooms to start with, and I was pulling out uniforms. When he entered the school for a second time, Cox was met by a familiar face. Coach Varner had made his way inside as well, and the two were joined by another of Varner's former players, Jeff Page. After saving teams' uniforms, Cox, Varner, and Page turned their attention to the photos and plaques hanging on the gym wall. Cox continued, "We got some of the photos out to start with, but the main gym and some of the locker rooms were one of the only parts of the school that did not burn all the way to the ground. I can't remember how many pictures, but there was an old wooden ladder there. We threw it up against the wall and knocked some of them down and was going out the door with them. The wall closest to the main lobby, we did get some of the pictures there, and with the fire department and what they were doing, they really salvaged the rest of the pictures and all of the plaques." But meanwhile, Sloan knew her dad was inside the burning school, which was by now completely engulfed in flames, reaching ever closer to the gym in the front office. Terrified for his safety, Tony consoled herself knowing that if the worst did happen, her dad would go while fighting to save what he had worked his entire life to build. "I remember the fire department trying to keep him from going back inside, which was a futile effort," said Tony. "It was history, it was records, it was memories, and all of those things wrapped up into one. We didn't have computers and technology then like we do now. It was all handwritten, most of it by Daddy, and files and on the walls. That was his community's pride. That was their memories and his. And they were willing to do whatever necessary to pull it off the walls or haul it out of the office to safety so that those records and memories were not gone forever." Cox estimates that he, Varner, Page, and others went in and out of the school multiple times over a period that neared 1 hour. in defiance of the firefighters that tried in vain to keep them outside of the now crumbling walls. But Cox and Varner managed one final harrowing trip inside the gutted school to save the last armful of precious items. I know it was 40 to 45 minutes in that neck of the woods that we kept going in, added Cox. You couldn't see up the hallways and you couldn't have gotten into the main school. We tried to go and did go to the main office. I do remember that. I remember Coach Varner going into the main office. I don't know what he got out of there, but then we came back down the hall and I told Coach, let's try to get some of these trophies. I busted the main trophy case and we took out 4 or 5 trophies, and it was getting to the point where you really couldn't see. The flames were down to about where the main office was, and it got to the main office area and started filling the gym up with smoke. The fire was almost in the main lobby when we finally went out the back door. Cox tried to go back one more time, only to be stopped by Varner. It was really bad by that point, and Coach Varner finally just said, Terry, we're not going back in. Let's just let it go. Having to concede that the school was lost, said Sloan, was among the hardest moments of her father's life. The look on Varner's face when the realization set in that nothing more could be done, said Tony, is one that she'll remember for the rest of her life. That look on my dad's face is one that I will never forget, Tony said. It looked like he was losing his best friend. I remember the tears rolling down his face as he stood back and watched what he had devoted his entire life to burn. But Tony added that her father was forever grateful that his former players had risked their own lives to save the history which they, too, had helped create. It was hard to keep him from going in again, but he knew ultimately that those memories were not worth a life, she said. It made him proud to know those guys were willing to potentially sacrifice their own safety for their contributions here, but to have to tell them not to go back inside, I know it was hard for him to do. By the time the sun began to rise, the fire departments had finally extinguished most of the blaze, and all that was left to do was begin the agonizing process of sifting through the rubble and reassembling the shattered pieces of Woodruff High School. Cox, Page, Varner, and the rest who had braved the hellish heat and flames had managed to save most of the school's athletic uniforms, a majority of the photos and plaques from the gym walls, a number of the school's championship trophies, and all of Varner's handwritten athletic records. It was a miraculous intervention in the face of overwhelming odds, but again, that was always the Wolverine way. Still, not all were rescued. 3 decades worth of Woodruff football game film were lost in the fire, as were several of Varner's championship rings. Not able to save the film was Cox's only regret from that night. I think I just wanted to do as much as I could to save as much of the history as I could, Cox said. I hate we couldn't get out the game film. That was the one thing that we were trying to do. Coach Varner had them locked up, but the smoke got so bad, that was just one thing we were trying to get to, but we never could. I would have liked to have shown my kids sometime what their dad had done back in the day. A small number of the team photographs were unable to be removed from the gym walls during the chaos. They were taken down from the smoldering ruins the next day, intact but bearing the scars of what had transpired. 35 years later, those few photographs are still stained yellow from the smoke and water, with faces and names mostly illegible now. But it serves as a constant reminder of what happened on January 11th, 1987, and it speaks loud and clear of the heroes who risked everything to save their school's history. There were no computers or hard drives back then that could have been a place of safekeeping, and nothing claimed by the firestorm could have been replaced or returned. Those constant physical reminders that don the surfaces of those old relics of Wolverine's past help keep the memory alive, said Sloan. In the aftermath of it all, I remember Daddy, and the fire authorities had a fit because he came back to the old gym. It had cracks in the wall that you could put your fist in, and he had a ladder and was getting those plaques and photos off the wall in the aftermath. The floor was saturated with water, and to me, that's what's so priceless about some of those photos, because you can see the smoke and water damage still there. It's a living reminder of what took place that night. But do you remember the story of the phoenix? The legend goes on to say that only one phoenix can live at any time, and it must be consumed by fire before it can be born again. And just like the phoenix, so too would Woodruff High School rise from the ashes. The conception began with the next day's sunrise, an omen perhaps of the magnificent transformation to come. People were just standing around crying and in disbelief over what was happening. Most of the older people who had gone to school there, and it was a very sad night, Cox said. But when the sun came up, it was a really bright blue day. I remember that. It was like a cleansing or a new beginning, and the Lord was looking down on us. Contributions poured in from everywhere to help Woodruff get its high school up and running again. Neighboring schools and towns donated textbooks and supplies to replace those which had been destroyed. The other schools in town opened their doors to the high school students so they could have a place to learn. And even world-famous rock band REO Speedwagon played a benefit concert for Woodruff at Clemson's Little John Coliseum to help offset the cost of the new school after lead singer Kevin Cronin had read about the fire. It was a total team effort in Wolverine spirit, and slowly indeed a new building took shape. I will say it brought the community back together at a time when people really weren't seeing eye to eye, Cox added. I think ultimately it really brought the town back together. Sloan even has some fond memories of that time. It made Daddy feel good to see the community rally around what meant so much to him, she said. It made him feel good to see that unity and everyone coming together. They moved a lot of the high school students into the elementary school. On one end was the high school, and on the other end was the elementary school, and we called it Ella High. The deep wounds seared into the flesh of the town by the fire and loss of the high school began to heal over time. Those responsible were brought to justice for their actions. The Wolverine sports teams returned to the courts and the fields, and pupils continued to learn, albeit in modified settings for a bit. In August of 1989, almost 31 months to the day of the fire, the new Woodruff High School opened its doors to students for the first time. Out of the flames and from beneath the ashes, a new legacy was born and merged with the old to fully complete the circle, and quite literally so. The new building was constructed around several surviving classrooms in a symbolic gesture to connect both the past and the present schools with one another. In the new gym, the team photos, plaques, and trophies, history saved from the infernal onslaught, christened the walls once more. Tony said her dad always taught her to see the good in every situation. Varner's heartbreak as he watched the high school be reduced to embers on that cold January night was abated by the joy it afforded him in the months that followed. That was probably one of the most devastating events in my daddy's life, but he came away from it and he always said to me afterward, "You've got to find the good in everything that takes place." At the time, his granddaughter Jessica was at the primary school, and his good was the mere fact that he was on the other end of the building. She came through and would sit in his office on his leg every morning before walking over to the primary school, and he always said that that was God's gift to him from the fire. Seeing his young granddaughter every morning, just starting her journey, was Varner's rebirth and his greatest joy during that time. For the town of Woodruff, it was the coming together of thousands to restore what had been so callously taken away. The final piece of the legend says that each phoenix lives 500 years before being taken by its fiery end. If you're inclined to put stock into such notions, then, just maybe, there are a few Wolverines who might have that long too.